my name is Shauna Beeler, and this is my video portion of the Replicating Research Project. First and foremost, I should start by saying that I personally believe that there's a definite need in education to research and apply why self-discipline and grit might be a stronger factor in long-term success for students than just IQ. So researching this for me was really interesting because I teach fine arts, and I find that students that have that individual drive and grit really excel both in their time at Vista Ridge with us and after. So I was very interested in doing this research. I should explain how my screen is set up for you before I kind of dive in and nerd out on all of my data. So over here, I changed all of the student names after I got their demographic information and their testing data just for privacy reasons. So you'll see that it just says student, and then over here, just a number. The testing population that I had, if I scroll down here, you can see there were 415 total 8th grade students that I have data for. 124 are on the honor roll. So this is the data from the feeder school coming in. I teach at the high school level, so this is the 8th grade class, and I was able to get a hold of their data. The 124 that are on the honor roll, that's considered as having a GPA of 3.5 and higher. So if we scroll back to the top here, you can see I have all the GPAs listed here. Then I went in, the test that I used for this is the CMAS test. It's really interesting to look at the data from this. So the CMAS gives them a performance level. A 1 or 2 is like did not meet expectations or low performance. Level 3 is approached or typical performance or the average student. And then 4s and 5s meets and exceeds or has a high performance. The little black squares that you see here are students that no scores were available for, so their parents opted them out. They just basically called before testing and said, my son or daughter's not coming in, they don't have to do this, so please excuse them. So unfortunately, the little black squares I don't have data for. I indicated those low performances, 1s and 2s, with red. Those average students are marked with yellow, and you can see the little indicators over here. And blue was exceeds or high performance. The CMAS tests on math, so that's this category here. English language arts is the next category over, science and social studies, and then their calculated growth here. So I went through Alpine Achievement is where I accessed all of this data, and I went through each individual student and marked out every score for each of these areas, their calculated growth, and then their determined performance level indicated by the CMAS test. I also personally went through and did this just because I think it's interesting. I noted some demographic information here, and then more importantly for my research, I indicated male or female because I found that later that there's a lot of correlation with that and some other research studies that I looked up. So it was kind of interesting. If we dive into this little average GPA test performance correlation, you can see here that those students in blue, they were the high performance with a GPA of 3.92. The students in yellow, those average or typical students, the average GPA was 3.77. And then those low performers, the average GPA was 3.68. So I thought that chart was kind of interesting to look at. And I tried to pick this apart from all aspects when looking at gender, GPA differences, maybe different demographics come into play. So, I mean, when you're testing something like grit and self-discipline, those characteristics can be really hard to measure. So I tried to get every facet of data or research that I could just in case there were correlations that could jump out. So if I scroll down here, you can kind of see there, I graphed and came up with averages for their overall performance. So you'll see here that in yellow, 41.94% of this tested population was typical or average, 12.10% fell below. Here's our 12.9% of opted out, and then 33.06% were in the 4 or 5 range, or those exceeds or meets expectations. This chart's really interesting because if you look at this side of the chart, 54.04% of them, so over half of the chart is typical or below average, yet they're on the honor roll, and it actually exceeds the number of students over here that are high achieving. So I thought that that was really interesting. This definitely suggests that self-discipline and grit could play a huge factor in whether or not they're on the honor roll, because only 33.06% of students were actually performing at that really high level. Although when you look at, if we scroll back up here, sorry for all this craziness on my screen, the high performance though, the average GPA was higher, even though there were a bigger number of students on the honor roll that maybe scored lower on standardized tests. The high performers had a higher GPA overall, so that was kind of interesting to note. I put demographics in here on this chart too, just because I like to keep that in mind. So this is the total student population of that school, and the demographics. And then I did demographics of just the 8th grade population tested, so the 124 students that you see listed on this data. I'm glad I went through initially and marked all of these male or female because I was really interested to see what that data looked like, primarily because of Angela Duckworth's research, specifically on gender differences. It directly relates to what I found to be true on my research. And I'll kind of explain what I found and then kind of her possible reasoning for it, which is really interesting. So males versus females on the honor roll. There are 81 female students on this honor roll of the 124, so 65.3%. And then there are 43 men on the honor roll at 34.7%. So the female population on this honor roll greatly outnumbers the men. But then averaging their scores, I was really curious to see what that would look like if this outweighed the men so much. So down here I have the average test scores of men and women. You can see here the guys actually have higher GPAs overall. The average is higher than the female population, even though 81 of that 124 were female. And Angela Duckworth says one possible reason, after she studied gender differences, it was found that girls are more self-controlled, which explains why they tend to get better grades. Thought that was really interesting research. I personally would like to look more into that because I think it would be very informative to research and move forward with a project like that. I think it's important to note, and I talked about this in my paper, so I'll explain it on the recording. I kind of talked about how I focused on this male-female difference, not just to point out the differences between men and women, because we all know there are differences between men and women. But I think it's most interesting because it potentially could be a more concrete way of measuring grit, whereas students with self-proclaimed discipline or knowledge of oneself might not be the most accurate. I don't know many 14-year-olds that have a very strong self-proclaimed definition of grit. I'm not even sure they could completely define what that means to them. So I think gender would be informative to tap into because it could be one potential concrete way of measuring. If we have a way to measure that, yeah, women really are more self-controlled with grades, potentially just another way to measure grit in students as people further explore this. And Angela Duckworth's research really helped in kind of identifying that. And she found the same with test scores, that men performed higher, but this student population might have better self-discipline just because of studies she's done. So that for me was very interesting on this research and this data. Another research article that I looked up on JSTOR, Intelligence as a Predictor of Life Success, really, really cool article. Not only objective, but also subjective measures of life success need to be carefully considered. IQ, with a full range of other factors, could affect success in life. So I think it's important to note, and some of these students, for example, when I went back and looked at this data, and some of these GPAs are just so high. There's one on here, it was this student here. I happen to have student 46 with this 4.29 GPA, and this kid is performing at a really high level, and I've noticed that in class with him as well. But I think he has grit, self-determination, as well as a very high IQ. And so you can see for him, he's in that blue range. He also has the highest GPA on here. He's tied with one other person to be valedictorian if he keeps it up. So knowing that student personally and keeping that in mind, looking at this data was really interesting to think about. I think that covers it for my data. The last thing that I think I covered all my graphs here. Let me just double check. Sorry, I have a lot of stuff on here. This was you guys are kind of seeing my brain web on here of how I processed everything. So I wanted to be able to share that with you so you could see how I came to the conclusions that I did. The last thing that I wanted to share, just because it speaks truth to me and what I do every day at work. This quote from Angela Duckworth really stood out to me. Our students need to be taught to appreciate that they're supposed to suffer when working hard on a challenge that exceeds their skill. They're supposed to feel confused. They need to gut it out through the natural human aversion to mental effort and feeling overwhelmed so they can evolve. This is what education is missing. So many students want easy answers without problem solving, but life isn't easy, and nothing worth it is either. We all need to be a little bit grittier. Thanks for watching. I look forward to reading your research. Thank you very much.